I was walking through the kitchen one day and there was this guy with a great big frying pan and he was spitting in it to make sure if the fat had got hot enough. That put me off hotel food for the rest of my life. My name is Tony Halliday. I was listening to music in my mother's womb. My mother was on the stage and my father was a piano player and a band leader. And I was about 6 at the time, which was the beginning of the war, when I became interested in playing music, and I had piano lessons from the age of 6. But there was music in my family all the time. During the war, bands used to have to go around the streets on a Sunday morning with the Home Guard behind them, and the bandmaster said to my father, you must join the band because of your musical ability. So you obviously can't carry a piano around the streets with you, so find yourself an instrument. So he went down into the Brighton lanes, which are notorious for antiques and second-hand things and all that sort of thing. And he bought a clarinet for 30 shillings. And he never did manage to play it. He used to just march around the streets and put it in his mouth and pretend to be playing, but he wasn't. And I became fascinated with this clarinet. So when he was at work every day, I would get it out of its case and have a blow on it. And I learned it all wrong. I was only 6 years old and I used to press a note down. Then I pressed the note down and I banged the note on the piano. If that was an A on the piano, it was an A on the clarinet, which is completely wrong. And in those days, they were all big bands. Glenn Miller and Harry James and bands like that. And I just loved the sound of the Glenn Miller band with the 4 saxophones with a clarinet lead on the top. In these big bands, there's 1 piano player and 5 saxophones, so I stand a much better chance of getting into a band playing the saxophone. And my father, he bought me a saxophone. Within 10 days of getting the saxophone, I was doing my first gig. 1951, I was still at school. I was 18 or 19 years old. I was invited to join Sid Dean's band, one of the best in the country, for 6 nights a week and 1 Saturday afternoon. We were doing 1 broadcast a week for music while you work, and I got another £3, 10 shillings for that. So when you consider all my friends were earning about 5 shillings a week doing a paper round, I was making money like there was no tomorrow. When I went into the Air Force, we were at war with the Egyptians. It was the Suez War. We were also at war with the Greek terrorists. I was running a band in Kyrenia, which was some miles away from Akrotiri, where I was stationed. And during the terrorist war, we were only allowed out in parties of 7, in uniform, fully armed. And every night I had to creep out of the camp in civvies on my own, get a taxi over to Kyrenia. But none of the officers took any notice because if I wasn't there, there was no live music on the island, so they turned a blind eye to my activities. And I was an armourer as well in my national service, so I used to stick a Luger pistol in my back pocket and off I'd go to these gigs. And when I added up how much I was earning, as opposed to the normal rate of a serviceman was £1, 7 and 6pence per week. And when I added up my income, I was earning £35 a week, which is crazy, absolutely crazy. Because if there's one thing that musicians have in common, it doesn't matter where they come from, whatever walk of life, they've all got one thing in common, and that is a wonderful sense of humour. And I used to laugh so much when I used to do these gigs. How I got home without being sick, I don't know. I was laughing so much. My father always used to say to me, you can enjoy your music, but whatever you do, don't do it for a living. It's too precarious and there's not enough money in it. So I formed my own engineering company. And I was making a lot of money with that. I got 20 employees just in a factory just along the road. So I was running an engineering business, playing in the evening. How I did it, don't ask me. In the 50s, music changed. It changed dramatically. There were two brilliant musicians called Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, and they revolutionised music in the world. And up till that time, they'd been all the big bands playing. And Charlie Parker and this other guy came out with this modern way of improvising. Very, very clever. And a lot of musicians tried to emulate them, but it was very, very difficult to learn to play it. Not only was it difficult to learn to play, but more to the point, it was difficult to understand. And so, whereas all the ballrooms up to that point of time had been full, as a follow-on from the war really, you can imagine all the ballrooms during the war were packed out with people. There were the wives whose husbands were away at war, wanting to go out and enjoy themselves, and there were all the Americans and Canadians over here wanting a girlfriend. So the ballrooms were absolutely brimmed to capacity. And that carried on for quite a few years after the war. It was a habit that people got into. And then this music came along, and it emptied the ballrooms almost overnight. The dancers didn't like it, they couldn't dance to it, or the beat was different, it was all on the offbeat and all sorts of different carryings on that the dancers didn't like at all. And so the ballrooms quickly emptied, and that was the death of all the musicians, or a lot of the musicians, because first of all, say you had a 12-piece orchestra, and when the hall started to empty, the entrepreneurs and managers quickly closed first of all they cut the bands down from about 12 to about 6, which of course affected the music wasn't as good, and in the end they closed the ballrooms down altogether. So there was a lot of musicians out of work. And the same thing was happening in the classical world. At one time, when I was quite young, every town had an orchestra. There was the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, the Worthing Symphony Orchestra, the Brighton Philharmonic Orchestra. Almost every large town had an orchestra. And all the musicians were employed by the council. And then, for some unknown reason, it was the government started to cut down on the amount of funding they gave to the councils. And so the councils couldn't afford to carry on running these orchestras. And so they changed them from full employment to just being paid for what they did on a subcontract, self-employed basis. So you might do a couple of rehearsals and one concert a week, and you got very little money for it, and these musicians couldn't live on it, so that more or less died a death. The orchestras eventually disbanded. And so what was happening in the classical world was exactly the same thing was happening in the dance band world, and an awful lot of musicians were out of work. It more or less crippled the industry. And the third point, which made it even worse, was the musicians' union were very strong at the time, and if you played any sort of instrument at all, you had to be in the union. And the union imposed a minimum wage, which was far too much. It was more than we'd been earning, and it was just not acceptable by the entrepreneurs and the band leaders. And so again, that was another reason why they cut down on the number of musicians. So one way or another, even to this day, the business is almost finished, really. It's hard. There's about 200 musicians in London who are doing almost all of the work, the television shows and doing the jingles and things like that. And they're doing very little. Even they're doing not a great deal of work, but there's about 200 musicians doing it all. And the other music that was doing well, which involved me quite a lot, was working in the hotels in London. There was a big scene going on of companies having a dinner, an annual dinner dance, and there was enough companies in London and around the surrounding district to keep most of the hotels in business. I was working almost every night of the week in some function or other to do with the dinner dance. And I was working at the Park Lane and the Dorchester and the Ritz, plus quite a few others, and it was more than enough to keep me going. There's a funny story. I was working at the Park Lane, and we weren't allowed. The musicians weren't allowed in the main entrance. We had to go around the back and through the kitchen. And I was walking through the kitchen one day, and there was this guy with a great big frying pan, and he was spitting in it to make sure if the fat had got hot enough. That put me off hotel food for the rest of my life. Anyway, that's how we were earning a living. I had my engineering business, and then something happened to the business. The work I'd been doing for 17 years all got taken away from me, and I had my nervous breakdown, and the business broke. I did the only thing I knew what to do, and that was to become a peripatetic music teacher. And then I was just playing around locally, still doing quite a lot of band work, but we got to a point where I didn't go bankrupt or anything. I managed to pay off the debts, and here I am, still alive. When I was earning quite a lot of money, I had, as I mentioned, I had 2 aeroplanes, a house in America, 3 classic motor cars, quite a big factory, and I was making money hand over fist. And then you can imagine to suddenly lose it all. It was quite a come down. About 10 years ago, I had a girlfriend who I'd had from the age of 17. We knew each other on and off for years and years, and she had macular degeneration. And she was always talking about it, telling me about hers was the dry type, but she was always talking about it. And one day I was sitting watching the television, and exactly the same thing happened as she'd been explaining to me for years and years. All the letters started going up and down and all over the place. So I went along to the hospital and I said, I've got macular degeneration. And they said, yeah, go to your doctor. And I knew that with macular degeneration, it could deteriorate in hours, let alone days and weeks. And I created such a fuss, I eventually got a nurse who took an interest in what was going on and agreed I'd got macular degeneration. And I was very fortunate because I got a very good friend who was the leading eye consultant in Sussex. We used to go flying together, and I taught his 3 children to play the piano, and we were great friends. And he did a lot to save my eyesight, as much as he could. And my left eye was deteriorating fairly rapidly, but and in those days you had to have, there was a cure for, I had wet macular degeneration, and there was not a cure for it, but they could stop it. And to stop it you had to have an injection, and these injections were £160 a time. And we knew that in a few months' time they were going to be free, but we couldn't wait that long. So there I was having these injections every few weeks, and I nearly went blind, but I do have some sight in it. And then lo and behold, the other one went. But knowing what was going on, I quickly went to the hospital, and they managed to save the sight in it to some degree. I can see a lot better out of this eye than that eye, but I was still registered as blind, and so I had to lose my driving licence and lots of things. You can imagine doing my classic motor cars, that all had to go. I couldn't do that anymore. Almost everything you can think of when you lose your sight, you can't do anymore. And I carried on playing for quite a while in the band until it got to a point where I just couldn't do it. One night I just said, that's it, sorry, I've got to pack up, I can't do this anymore. But I've been playing with this particular orchestra called Ronnie Smith. I've been working with them for 56 years when all this happened. And it was at a time when the band leader died. And so as I couldn't play the saxophone anymore, couldn't see the music, I became the conductor. And I was doing that right up until about 18 months ago, and I decided enough was enough. We'd been rehearsing in Shoreham, very close to where I lived, and so that was no problem. And then we lost that place and we had to go to Worthing to rehearse, and that was about 8 miles, and I got no means of getting there. None of my friends came in this direction, so it became ever increasingly difficult for me to get to rehearsals and this, that and the other. And I thought to myself, maybe I've had enough now. I've been in the business for 66 years, I think I'll retire, which is what I've done. I don't play at all now. You can't half play an instrument because your embouchure goes and your lung capacity goes and your coordination goes. You can't really do it. But every musician is different. I mean, for the likes of me, it doesn't bother me whether I can see or whether I can't see. I can still play. But I've played with an awful lot of brilliant musicians, symphony orchestras and all these people. And they're brilliant musicians. They can read fly droppings, but they can't link two notes together if they haven't got the music. And it's I don't know how they manage. It's a finish of their career, I would have thought. I don't know.